This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Oh yeah, mama.
That's right. We're happy to have you with us here today. We have one hell of an episode for you. To support the podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, tell a friend, post about us, give us a review. Anything like that really helps us out a lot. You can also follow us on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We're on Facebook, and we also have a subgroup on our Facebook called Citizens of the Milky Way, where we like to interact with our fans, and anyone can just post articles and memes or anything like that. We highly recommend you go ahead and check that out.
Yes, please.
And if you would like more bonus Creep Street content, if that one episode a week is just not cutting it for you.
It never is, pal.
And it's not cutting it.
It never is.
You can just head on over to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast for some great bonus content there. We have 3 separate tiers, all with fantastic content that will keep you satisfied.
Oh, yeah, baby. Yeah.
Now, last week, we just did a spooky, scary episode on the Devil's Pool of Babinda. We were talking about the Devil's Pool in Australia. We went down under last week, but this week, we're doing something a little different. We're back in the good old US of A.
Oh, yes.
Dylan, will you please tell the people what in the hell we're talking about?
Today, we are talking about an American classic. Ghouls and gals, this episode is The Flatwoods Monster. And really quick, let me give you my sources up top.
Would you please?
First, a book called The Flatwoods Monster by George Dudding, and then a documentary called The Flatwoods Monster, A Legacy of Fear by Small Town Monsters.
Oh. Fantastic.
Yes. Now, this is, like I said, this is one of those that's kind of hard to quantify.
Right.
I think most people would consider it a UFO sort of thing, but it branches well beyond that. This strays into Grinning Man territory, Mothman territory. Very interesting, bizarre things. One I'm very excited to dive into.
I love these episodes. I love these episodes where you just never know what to expect and you just don't know what the actual flying fuck is occurring.
Oh yeah, and the Flatwoods Monster is a staple of American folklore, so everybody buckle in. So a little bit of backstory about the town of Flatwoods. The town of Flatwoods is located in Braxton County, West Virginia. If you'll remember, West Virginia and the surrounding states have been the setting for many Mothman and Grinning Man sightings.
Mm-hmm.
And
a lot of paranormal activity in general in this part of the country.
Absolutely, and that's why how this may or may not tie into the Indrid Cold story I find very fascinating. So Braxton County was created by the Virginia Assembly all the way back in 1836. This was before West Virginia was even a state. And the county's name, Braxton, comes from Carter Braxton, who was a Virginia statesman and one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, pop off, King.
So a little bit of history there for you, Flatwoods was and still is a very small town. At the time of the incident, which happened in September of 1952, the town only had a population of about 300. And from what I could gather today, the estimated population is still about the same. It hovers around 265. If you wanted to visit Flatwoods, West Virginia, you'd get off at exit 67 right along Interstate 79. And as you pull off that exit, you'd probably be greeted by what you'd expect to find at any average American exit. There's a Walmart Supercenter. There's a Days Inn Conference Center, and even the Central Region Jail. I guess that's more because Flatwoods is near the center of the state. But the actual community of Flatwoods lies a little farther up the road, up Virginia Route 19. And if you drove far enough, you'd come across this quaint little town. Still as quiet as it was in 1952. And as you're driving in, you'd be greeted by a sign, a welcome sign that reads, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster."
The Green Monster?
Yes, this thing has many names. The Phantom of Flatwoods, the Flatwoods Monster, the Green Monster. It's got many names.
Wow.
Now, the author of the book that I used as a source, George Dudding, was actually born and raised in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, site of the Silver Bridge collapse in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. And that is where Mothman really was popping off.
Yeah, absolutely. He had written a book about Mothman, actually, and would later turn his sights on the Flatwoods Monster, so that's how we came up with our source here. He said the locals are often happy to talk about the incident. Some believe it, some don't, but everyone's usually happy about the notoriety and legend it has brought Flatwoods, and of course, the money that it brings in by paranormal enthusiasts who visit. There's even like a Flatwoods Monster Museum downtown. Granted, this will actually be the 70th anniversary of the Flatwoods incident, so it's actually kind of hard to find anyone who was alive at the time of the incident, or at least had a direct connection to it. Yet the locals will happily recall the tale, and interestingly enough, the majority of the stories are surprisingly uniform, meaning there, of course, people add things as the years go by, but like the main story hasn't really changed to its credit. So now, we've buttered the biscuit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Now it's time to put it in our mouths.
Okay. That is both exciting and rich.
Let's go back to the actual incident. The night is Friday night, September 12th, 1952. Working at the sheriff's office that night was Sheriff Robert L. Carr and Deputy Burnell J. Long. The sheriff's office was located in the nearby town of Sutton. It was a quiet night with not a lot going on when suddenly the phone rang. And Deputy Long answered it to find it was a man named Woodrow Thomas Eagle calling. Now, Eagle was a mechanic from the nearby unincorporated town of Strange Creek. Right away, Deputy Long could tell Eagle was in a very excited state. He was really worked up about something. Eagle claimed that he had been hitchhiking about 13 miles to the southwest of Flatwoods near the town of Gassaway, walking right along the Elk River. As he's going about his business, trying to flag down a ride, he saw something strange in the sky. He said it was some sort of aircraft, but it looked to be like a ball of fire, almost. It was very brightly lit, and whatever it was, he claimed that it crashed on the other side of the river into a wooded hillside. He was actually making this call from a payphone. When he was able to flag someone down, he had them drive him over to the nearest payphone so he could call the police to report what he had seen, thinking maybe this was like a plane accident or something.
Oh, damn. Okay. Yeah.
Well, Sheriff Carr and Deputy Long decided to head out there and check this out for themselves, in case this was a plane or something and, there was an emergency and people needed help. So they drove down to the area the caller had said they were, and they interviewed the locals around there. They did an initial search of the area to see if they could find the downed craft, but were unable to find anything. One thing was for certain, though, all the locals they interviewed were convinced that something did crash in the wooded hillside. Now, while this is all going on, we are going to jump vantage points.
Oh, wow.
This is one of those, apparently overall, there were like 6 UFO incidents. But only 1 or 2 like monster sightings. So it's kind of interesting. And we'll get into that deeper later, the deeper we get into this. Mm-hmm. So back over at Flatwoods proper, while this is going on, a group of kids had gathered for an evening game of football down at Flatwoods Elementary. It was now past 7 p.m. on that Friday evening, so of course faculty and staff are all gone. During school hours, the teachers, you see, wouldn't let the boys play full-on tackle football. Mm-hmm. So that's why the kids would like to meet up after hours so they can play a good old game of tackle football.
Okay, the boys are out here being reckless, being a little naughty.
Absolutely. And the kids there, I guess, were kids of all ages. In particular, some of the particular individuals which we'll be focused on in our story was 17-year-old Eugene Lemon, who also happened to be a member of the West Virginia National Guard, a 14-year-old Neil Nunley, 13-year-old Eddie May, and his 11-year-old brother, Freddie May, as well as a 10-year-old Tommy Hayer and 10-year-old Ronnie Shaver. Also, there was Lemon's dog in attendance, was with him. There were several other boys too, but they would come to play or at least watch the game. Sounds to me like it was just something neighborhood kids would go do.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it was about 7:15 p.m., and the kids are in the middle of a game when there came a loud noise, coming seemingly from everywhere and nowhere at once. They looked up in time to see a brightly shining object go shooting across the sky. This was like no plane they were familiar with. According to my source, the craft resembled a silver dollar with flames shooting out of the back.
Ooh.
The blazing object shot across the sky over the town directly towards a hilltop that was pretty much opposite of the schoolyard. They watched in amazement as this strange craft suddenly directly descended, seemingly on the hilltop, but not like a plane. A plane wouldn't move like that. All of a sudden, it flew like a plane and then suddenly descended directly down, almost like a helicopter would.
Wow. Okay,
like it stopped and then went down.
So it doesn't really seem like it was crashing, per se.
Exactly, even though it looked like it was on fire.
Right.
Well, obviously no plane is going to move like that. So the hill in particular, where this was located, was on the land of a farmer named George Bailey Fisher. And from the schoolyard where the kids were, they were almost certain they could see a light of some kind glowing where the craft would have landed. Okay, so there's something in the hills. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, this is 1952, and flying saucers are all the rage. The Roswell incident was literally just 5 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Flying saucers, alien invaders, it's all over movies, TV, all that sort of stuff. So the boys decided, well, they're going to go tell some adults what they just saw and then go see what this thing was for themselves. So the 6 boys I mentioned, along with the dog, Lemon's dog, ran along the railroad tracks back to the house of Eugene Lemon's parents, who lived on Depot Street. Their names were a Joseph and Leotha Lemon, and they also happened to be the parents of Kathleen May, who was in her early 30s. She was the mother of Eddie and Freddie, the 2 other boys.
Eddie and Freddie, damn.
So I'm guessing they were Eugene's cousins.
Oh.
Kathleen's maiden name was obviously Lemon, so yeah. She was also at the Lemon's house that evening as she had stopped by to pay a visit. Well, all of a sudden the boys come running in and they tell them their wild story. So they're in a heightened state of excitement, and the boys tell them everything about the strange object and how it sat down, it seemed, on top of the hill. Kathleen questioned the boys and decided that whatever they had seen, she figured they were telling the truth. They seemed very earnest about what they were telling her. And they wondered, obviously, maybe what landed up there was a meteorite. And so she was now just as excited as the boys and decided to accompany them up the hill to see for themselves. So just to recap, the group taking off to head up the hill consisted of Kathleen May, her sons Eddie and Freddie, Neil Nunley, Ronnie Shaver, Tommy Hayer, and Eugene Lemon and his dog. So now the trip up the hill wasn't too bad in terms of distance. It was only about a quarter mile to the top, but I guess it was rather steep. It was clear, though, from the moment they started the trek up the hill that there was definitely a pulsating light up there.
Oh, that's so creepy.
Which made them worried that maybe this was a plane that had gone down. So they kept going, and as they approached the top of the hill, they knew they were going in the right direction because that pulsating reddish-orange glow kept getting brighter. But something was interesting about it, though. The closer they got to the top of the hill, where they thought the light was coming from, they were able to tell that whatever the source of light was, it seemed to be coming from the other side of the hill. When they got to the hilltop, they were able to look down and see where the object was. Sitting in an open pasture at the base of the hill was what appeared to be an object or craft of some kind that was glowing. They estimated the thing to be about 5 feet tall and about 25 feet in diameter. Now, from what I can tell, this wasn't like a saucer, like a simple flying saucer. This craft was said to be a ball of fire that was more spherical in shape, or more precisely, a half sphere.
A ball of fire?
Right. The group cautiously approached the craft to the point that they got within about 50 feet of this thing. That's when they began to notice a strange, loud noise that seemed to be either coming from the craft itself or from somewhere in the vicinity They would later describe the sound as being comprised of a few things. There was a sort of sizzling, hissing sound, but this was in addition to a loud sort of squealing and thumping. One of the boys would later specifically say it sounded like, quote, someone beating on a sheet of canvas. While everyone stopped in their tracks, it wasn't just the strange craft and unusual noises that were unsettling them. All around them was a strange, heavy mist that made it difficult to see anything. And on top of this, the strange odor in the air was something like burning metal or sulfur. And it was so strong, it started to burn their noses and irritate their eyes. Kathleen May didn't know what this thing was, but she made the wise decision that everyone should get out of there, especially since they were getting physical reactions to it. Who knows if this thing's radioactive or something.
Right, exactly. She's smart. And that's something we all need to remember here. If you think you come across a UFO, anything like that, do not fucking touch it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they had begun to leave, going back the way they came, when they caught a sudden movement to their left and a strange noise. They all turned to look, and at the side of the road there was something up in an oak tree, looking at them. In the tree were two large eyes that glowed in orange and green. They turned their flashlights toward the tree, assuming an animal had just perched itself up there. But when their lights fell upon the entity, they were overwhelmed with horror. Here's an excerpt from my source describing what they saw. A huge, towering, monster-like object appeared before them in the flashlight beam. Apparently, the flashlight had disturbed the huge, machine-like creature, causing it to suddenly light up internally and project beams of light outward. The light that was emitted actually illuminated the area around them. Then the creature or monster stepped out from the huge tree. Its form towered above them with a height of 10 to 12 feet as the group stared in terror. As they viewed the alien or machine, it appeared to have a round, blood-red face with big, bright, glowing eyes that projected beams of light toward them. There was some type of helmet or shroud over its head, which was dark-colored and later described as being shaped like an ace of spades symbol that you might find on a deck of playing cards. The rest of the thing seemed to be covered with a green metallic material which hung down in vertical folds, sort of like corrugated sheet metal roofing, possibly to give it structural strength. Wow.
Okay, so they're seeing this weird being.
Yes, it's got like a red face.
Yeah.
But the body is like green. And the bottom half, from what I can tell, it's almost like it has these like drapery round it reminds me of a Dalek from Doctor Who, the bottom half. And then the head has these two big eyes, and then the shroud that's in the shape of like a spade you see on a playing card.
Right. So the shape of the spade thing, that is not its body, that's like its clothes.
That from what they could tell, it looked like the head was here, and then it was almost like a cape with a with a protruding like collar that went up. Really, this thing, if DC Comics fans will know, early Green Lantern, I think pre like 60s Green Lantern, he had like a lot of red, and he had this huge cape with these like towering like this collar around the cape. It kind of reminds me of that, but like
okay.
Yeah, it's this weird shape, and it's almost got this insect-like face in a weird way.
Yeah.
It's very hard to explain. And it, like, floats. It moves by, like, floating. You'll see it'll hover down from the tree. Very interesting. So the group is standing there in just utter shock. They kept their flashlights trained on the creature, frozen where they stood. Then the creature began to hover out of the tree. And the key word here, like I said, is hovered. It, like, floated. This creature-machine hybrid appeared to literally hover down from the tree. Eugene stepped back from the thing. He was terrified. He tripped and fell, dropping his flashlight. So he's
God.
Yeah. So he's scrambling around in the dark, looking for the flashlight. The others could still see the thing. There was enough light coming from that craft. They could still see it in the pulsating light. The entity at first appeared to be approaching them, but then turned and began floating back down towards the craft. But as it passed by the group, it suddenly sprayed them with a mysterious oily substance.
Ew, what the fucking hell?
I know, fucking stupid.
You hear about this kind of stuff sometimes when it comes to alien encounters and shit like that.
Go fuck yourself, aliens. Like what a shitty thing to like do to somebody.
And what the fuck is that? Ew, that's so heinous.
So heinous. Well, the group had seen enough. They ran like hell back down the hill Eugene's dog apparently led the way.
Oh, good. You can always count on a dog to just get you out of some bullshit with fucking oil being sprayed on your ass.
Even the dog had been sprayed with the stuff.
Oh, God.
They all got back down to the Lemon residence where Joseph and Leotha were shocked at their appearance and frightened by the story they were telling him. They helped everyone get cleaned up. Apparently, Eugene was so shaken by what had happened that he passed out.
Yeah.
When he got back home and had to be revived with smelling salts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame him.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Many of them were having a sort of reaction to the oily substance. It kind of burned and made it hard to breathe. Some of them would even have lingering symptoms for days. In fact, Eugene's dog acted strangely as well and actually died a few days later.
You're kidding me.
I'm not kidding.
Oh my f***ing God, this absolute chode.
Right.
Meister.
What a piece of shit.
I cannot with that shit.
Yeah, fuck these assholes. Didn't we do one about, didn't an alien kill a dog in one of our stories? Like
I mean, probably.
Probably.
I don't
Go
know.
fuck them. Fuck these stupid extraterrestrial assholes.
I can't. I just can't. I can't with it. And I won't. And I shan't. And I shan't.
Reports suggest that many of the symptoms they were experiencing were similar to those who had been exposed to mustard gas. Kathleen May would later tell reporters about the creature they had seen, saying that it, quote, looked worse than Frankenstein. It had a bright red face, bright green clothes, a head that resembled an ace of spades, and its clothes from the waist down hung in great folds. About this time, back at the police station, Sheriff Carr and Deputy Long were just returning from responding to that first call that happened near Gasaway when they got the second call. They were floored. They were like, what are the odds that we'd get such two similar calls happening in the same area from two different people, different incidents? So Carr and Long head out to the Lemon residence to kind of get the lowdown on what had happened. Within 30 minutes after they had arrived, the press from local outlets even began showing up.
Oh, no.
A reporter from the Braxton Democrat named Asa Lee Stewart had arrived and asked the witnesses questions along with the authorities. It was clear that the witnesses were still quite shaken by everything that had happened. Once they had done their questioning, the next thing to do was to scale the hill and have a look for themselves. Keep in mind, as we said before, UFO sightings were huge at the time, and everyone was a bit hesitant to go up that hill. Sure, the sheriff and the deputy had firearms with them, I assume, but they were still a bit hesitant.
Yeah, I mean, it's you don't know what good those are going to do in this situation.
Absolutely. But after some discussion, Sheriff Carr, Deputy Long, the reporter, and some of the witnesses, they armed themselves and began the trek up the hill. Here's something I thought was interesting. So the group is making their way up the hill. All's quiet, and this time there's no glow of light emanating from on top of the hill or over the other side of it. Well, the sheriff and deputy decide this was a wild goose chase to attempt to do at night, so they were going to come back in the daylight to investigate. Okay, chums.
Yeah, okay. That's a little,
Yeah.
a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Convenient.
Yeah,
maybe.
absolutely.
Yeah.
They took off back down the hill, but the others decided to press on. Well, the next day, the police and the reporters came and did a search of the place. While they saw no monster or craft, they did see clues left behind. There were two gouges in the earth that ran down the side of the hill to where the craft had been seen resting. And of course, the strange oily substance was everywhere, and many noted the lingering smell of burned metal or sulfur. So it's almost like this craft landed at the top of the hill and then skidded down the side to park, essentially.
Right.
Now, you may remember, we started off this story and there was that strange light reported by that hitchhiker over in Gasaway, which happened the same night as the Flatwoods encounter. Well, the night after the initial encounter, so the 13th, Saturday the 13th, 1952, another sighting would happen in Gasaway. This time it happened to a couple named George and Edith Stitnowski and their 18-month-old son. The Stitnowskis were actually from West Babylon, New York, and they had just happened to be driving through the unincorporated area of Strange Creek on their way back home to New York. It was about 8 p.m. when the family's car began sputtering and acting weird. And they're, going down this rural stretch of road, and finally the engine just gives out, so they have to pull over to the side of the road. They tried starting it, and it didn't, so they decided, well, they didn't want to flood the engine, so they were going to wait a little bit before trying again to see if it would start. Well, that's when something caught their attention. Down over the bank, the other side of the road, they noticed a glowing object. It glowed with an almost violet-colored light. When they rolled down their windows for a better look, they were immediately struck by the very strong odor of burning sulfur.
Uh-oh, here we go again.
And there was also that dense mist all around them. And it seemed as though this sulfuric mist was coming from that glowing object. So George Titnowski gets out of the car and begins approaching whatever this thing is. And the closer he got, the more he realized it probably wasn't a good idea to get close to this thing. His lungs burned whenever he inhaled the mysterious mist. It's sort of like an electrical sensation all over his body, and his legs were growing numb.
Oh, God.
So he decided, nah, not for me.
Yeah.
He turns around and he starts walking back to the car.
That's wise.
That's when his wife, Edith, and still in the car with their son, suddenly shouted, "Watch out! There's something behind you!" George turned around to see what could only be described as a monster. It stood 10 to 12 feet high and was quickly approaching him. George turned and ran like mad back to the car. He jumped in the car, and right as he did, him and his wife quickly rolled up the windows and locked all the doors. Mrs. Titnowski grabbed their son from the back seat and held him close and crouched down behind the dashboard. Remember, the car wouldn't start, so they sat there in quiet horror as the entity approached the car. Floating as it did, it circled the car, examining it. It even came so close that it laid a hand, or whatever its hand is, on the hood of the car and looked in at the family. Then, as quickly as it had come, the entity just went off back into the woods and disappeared. Still terrified, sitting in their car, the family watched as the craft suddenly took off in a flash of light. It seemed to rock back and forth and then was gone. Some say that it vanished, like it was a small light that got smaller and smaller until it vanished.
Wow.
That's what some people say. They sat there in shock for several minutes, and then they came to the realization they should probably just get the heck out of there.
Oh, yeah.
So they tried starting their car, and this time it started up just fine, as it usually had.
God.
Remember, this is something we see often. Think Night of the Silver Man, all that stuff where the car would stop, the thing would happen, and then it would start again when they left.
Mm-hmm.
Well, their family was too shaken by this experience to drive all the way home that night. So they drove a few miles down the road to the nearby town of Sutton, where they stopped at an all-night diner to gather their thoughts and have some dinner. After dinner, they debated whether or not they should even tell anyone. They stayed at a local motel there in Sutton that evening, and the next morning they stopped at a gas station. And as George was filling up the family car, an attendant at the station asked how they got this strange V-shape burned onto the hood of their car. Thinking, what the heck? The family decided to just tell the attendant about their experience the night before. Well, it didn't get into specifics, but apparently, however this guy reacted made the family decide they weren't going to tell anyone else, and they got in their car and drove back to New York.
Fuck that guy.
I know, right? They wouldn't tell of their story for another 3 years. So yeah, you can imagine the guy was,
chode about it.
Was kind of a chode about it. Well, in all, according to many of my sources, there were 6 UFOs sighted in the sky that night. Keep in mind, not monster sightings, just UFO.
Right.
So let's have a look at some of these theories before I tell you one last tale. There are 8 common theories as to what this thing may have been. 1, an alien/extraterrestrial UFO. 2, a cryptid. 3, some sort of an interdimensional supernatural creature.
Right.
4, a remotely piloted vehicle, so like an early form of like a drone or something.
Right.
Some sort of psychological warfare device, whether it was United States military or another country's military. One of the most common quote-unquote rational explanations is that it might have been an owl, and there's actually some convincing evidence when they talk about how it might have been a large barn owl. There's actually some pretty interesting stuff about that. Of course, was it a hoax? Who knows? And finally, a meteorite.
Interesting.
So I think you hear about these things in the sky, and you probably are wondering, well, that creature was probably associated with those UFOs. It's probably extraterrestrial. Well, that may very well be. However, just days before the Flatwoods Monster incident, there was a sighting that greatly resembled what everyone else had saw. Audra Harper was 23 years old at the time of the incident, and she lived just 3 miles north of Flatwoods along Route 19. Audra had a friend over, and they decided to take a stroll to the store nearby to buy a few things. And it was dark, so they took a flashlight with them, and to save a little time, they decided to take a shortcut through a field and some wooded area. Well, during their walk, the glow of what seemed like a fireball on the hillside grabbed their attention. They thought nothing of it, assuming that it was, a neighbor out fox hunting and who probably started a campfire. But then they watched as the glow quickly faded and a figure rose up in the darkness. According to Audra, whatever this thing was, it was, quote, 3 heights of a man. The 2 friends took off running towards the direction of the store, only to look back to see that the entity was chasing them. They ran as hard as they could. Coming to a gate, they quickly opened it and turned back to lock it behind them because this gate also kept in a lot of farm animals, too.
Oh, yeah.
The creature had gotten right to the gate as they successfully locked it, and they ran like mad across the rest of the field. Apparently, this field was absolutely riddled with rocks and boulders, and it was usually nearly impossible to walk through at night. But that's how frightened they were. They literally blasted through this.
And how weird that they didn't, fall down.
Right, and apparently they were climbing over boulders and shit. Apparently Kathleen May, the mother of the boys, when they were running back down the hill, apparently, scaled a fucking fence.
Or maybe that has something to do with the effect of this being.
Who knows? That's a good question. That's a very good question. So they blaze right through the field and don't stop till they get to the store. They told their story to some of the folks at the store and were met with disbelief. They were too scared to go back home, but there happened to be a group of neighborhood boys there buying beer who overheard their story, and they accompanied the 2 ladies safely back home. A few days later, when the 2 had heard about the Flatwoods Monster, they became convinced that that was what they had seen. So is this monster related to UFOs? If it was there before these things in the sky? Maybe it was coming to pick that thing up. Maybe it had been there a while and it was getting picked up. But it seems like maybe this thing was there before the bright lights in the sky.
Wow. Because you just assume originally that this thing came from that bright thing in the sky.
Exactly, right.
But maybe not.
Right. Well, there's also some interesting stuff that implies maybe some sort of cover-up. Every time, Ivan T. Sanderson and a few other very well-known people who would kind of become giants in the paranormal research community came and took samples, but whenever they would send in samples of things, they would suddenly go missing. Things like that. And when other people would send in, they would suddenly go missing. Apparently, at the Lemon House that night, there was a man who worked at a funeral parlor who just happened to be there, stopping by to see the family, and he actually helped do some first aid and stuff on people who needed it and whatnot. Well, later, when interviewed, he claimed to have never been there.
Huh.
And it seemed more like he was scared to talk about it than anything else.
Okay.
Well, finally, in 1993, a witness at the Flatwoods Regional Jail, no idea if they were an inmate or just an employee, claimed to see a glowing object that glowed orangish red that landed in the snow near some houses in the eastern part of town. He claimed that moments later, a large creature that he described as being like a, quote, giant wolf appeared where the glowing light had been. But it didn't stop there. In his amazement, the witness watched as the entity morphed from a wolf form into a very huge black humanoid. Sounds like a shadow person.
Yes, it does sound like a shadow person.
Are these skinwalkers? I don't know, but that opens up a new element. Now, keep in mind, this was 1993, so many years, almost 41 years since what had happened, the original Flatwoods Monster sighting. It's fascinating.
And it does make you think more so is that interdimensional? Because that is something that we've talked about with shadow people before, is maybe they actually are just interdimensional beings and that's how they manifest in a way that we perceive them, but that doesn't mean that necessarily they always appear that way.
Exactly, right. Now, the Indrid Cold thing, I'm not so sure, because every time people have seen Indrid Cold, even though he's freaky as hell, he seems somewhat benevolent.
Yes.
This thing now, who knows? They didn't get time enough to get to know the thing, but this seems more scary and also just dangerous. Even if the thing itself is benevolent, just from the eyes watering, who knows if it's safe to even be near it? So who knows?
Right.
Maybe this thing is neutral. Yeah, it's very fascinating. John Keel has written many stuff on that. This is a big, and it kind of does weirdly. People try to fit it into the Indrid Cold mythos. Who knows if it does?
Right. It could, but it could be something else. I don't know. I mean, Dylan, what do you think? Do you think this thing is a cryptid? Do you think it's an alien? Do you think it's interdimensional? What do you think?
I think it's an interdimensional traveler.
Okay.
Is what I think.
You came to that quick. I thought you were going to be like, I really don't know. And you were like, it's an interdimensional traveler.
I think so. Well, here's my thing, is there's a few different ways these crafts take off. Sometimes you hear them taking off into the sky. Sometimes it's like there's a light and they're gone, which sounds a lot like the stuff that was going on at Skinwalker Ranch.
True.
Well, Maureen, that's going to wrap it up for the Flatwoods Monster.
Dylan, thank you so much for doing all that fantastic research. Everyone, please let us know what you think. What do you think is going on with the Flatwoods Monster? Is this a cryptid? Is this something else? Is it an alien? Is it something we didn't even talk about at all? I mean, I don't know. This thing is weird, I'll tell you that.
Yes, and there's some interesting angles about it we might jump into in our Patreon episodes this month. Very fascinating stuff. The people that witnessed this thing, their story has stayed the same for decades. In the documentary, they interview Freddie and Eddie May, who were just 10 years old, or I think it was 10 and 12 or something. They were young boys at the time.
Right.
Their story has remained the same ever since.
Wow.
Everyone's story has remained the same. The people that were actually there until they're dead, the people that are still alive, their story's the same, and the people that have died, their story remained the same until they died. So, there's a lot to unpack with this one.
Absolutely.
It's like, what if whatever this light was looking for or was trying to pick up this thing? Like maybe it had been here and it was getting picked up. Who knows?
Who effing knows?
Well, I'll tell you who knows. Who knows how to get things done. The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers.
Please, baby, please.
Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker Bex Martin, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, and the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth.
That's right, everyone. Thank you so much to all of our Patreon subscribers. And if you want to join them, feel free to check out patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast for all of that bonus content that we know you are just gonna love.
Yes. Once again, like, rate, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your loved ones, evangelize the sweet gospel of Creep Street.
Please.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
A good night and goodbye.
Goodbye.